Hi, and welcome to, or welcome back to, the 2021 CyberX Canadian Women in Cybersecurity Conference. Today, we are going to be talking about privacy and pushing people off the deep end. We've seen a lot of amazing advances in technology in the last few years, but it tends to be that when we get to convenience and personalized software and hardware, that we are also sacrificing privacy for that technology. A great example in my own house is we actually upgraded to a new television last year because we realized it was the last version of that model that didn't have a microphone attached to the circuit board, and we didn't want a microphone in our TV. So today we're going to talk a lot about privacy as it relates to Canadians, as it relates to new technology that's coming out, and how COVID has affected that. I am joined by an amazing panel of guests today and speakers, so I'm going to allow them to introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Vanessa. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Kat, and thank you for having me this year. So my name is Vanessa. I'm a data governance and emerging technology lawyer at Fasken, and I specialize on cybersecurity and also everything privacy related.
Fantastic. How about you, Mary?
Thank you, Kat. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mary Siklis. I'm the Director of Information Security at Point Click Care.
Perfect. All right. So to get started, what I would like to know from each of you is either why you got into privacy or why privacy is important to you, and your worst example of privacy gone wrong in one of these new technologies. Vanessa?
Thank you. So how I got into privacy was a long story of academic researches, but essentially I started to work on cyber espionage and on the duty of loyalty. What does it mean to be betrayed? And what does that mean in terms of trust and power relationship? And through this study, I ended up looking at privacy and the role of women into the private life in general, and how that translates into relationship of power over time. So I think my academic interest in privacy comes through that. But I think my day-to-day interest, it just comes from being a human being, seeing your kids taking the classes online, going to the hospital, seeing all these things that are connected. I think today it's part of our civic duty to be aware of that and be interested into our integrity.
Fantastic. And what's the worst example you've seen lately of privacy gone wrong?
Quite frankly, there are many. So there are many, but those that I find concerning are actually these health-related technologies that look at what we call femtech. So they look at menstruation cycles. They look at information that we consider as women to be very sensitive, but that are not always considered to be medical information either. So I have concern that these type of data may fall in between two categories and may not be given the right contextual meaning that they should have.
I love that example so much because there is currently a class action lawsuit against Flow, which many of the men are probably like, I don't even know what that is. Flow is exactly that. It's a menstruating app, and it's for women to track their cycles for various reasons. And that data was being handed over to third parties. And so for women who were using that app, they didn't realize that that is health data, and it was being given away. How about you, Mary? How did you get into privacy, or why do you love it? And what is a bad example that you've seen?
Thank you, Kat. So my main background is information security, but being in this field, you can't avoid having to deal with anything privacy related. I got into it more back in 2016 when I worked for a dating site that was breached. Not going to name who they were, but back then having to deal with the various privacy laws, the regulations, it just gave me a different perspective of what the meaning was. And having worked with that company, the definition of what meant to be private was different than what we see in healthcare. So your personal interest when it comes to being intimate, I did not know that that was also deemed to be private information back in the day. So that did shed some light on stuff that we need to be very careful on what we share, whether it's online or even on paper.
Fantastic. All right, so I'm Kat Coode, and so I'm a data privacy consultant. I got into this because I used to be a software architect and developer at BlackBerry for a very long time. And I was there when iPhone launched, and people wanted the iPhone because they could do more stuff with it. But the real reason that they could do more stuff was actually because iPhone allowed apps to connect into contacts and their calendars and their email. And so I sort of witnessed when the world changed and privacy didn't matter because the technology was cool. And that's sort of when I realized that people didn't appreciate what they were actually giving away. And so I've been doing consulting since then to help people have a better understanding of this. And so my worst example of privacy in this year is probably TikTok. I think people don't appreciate the sheer amount of information that is being taken from there. And there's also some nefarious things going on with that information. So there's historically teenagers' contact books are being taken and then sold. And then hackers and infiltrators are using that information. So I just think we could put all the social networks in that bucket, but TikTok is probably high on my list. All right, so to get started, we're gonna level set and say, what is the word privacy mean to you? So for me, privacy isn't about what you have to hide. It's about the control of your own data. And I think the reason that we often hear people say, oh, I have nothing to hide, is because years ago, privacy was what you did behind your own closed doors. So privacy was, you can't see what actions I'm doing. But now that we're online, privacy is not just about what you do, it's really about how you think. It's about what you click on and what you like and which sites you navigate to. So there's a whole new world of information that's coming out there. And then we add to that things like biometrics and all sorts of digital identity information. So privacy to me, again, is about controlling this data. It's not that you have something to hide or don't have something to hide. It's that it's your personal data. Some of it's irreplaceable, and you should have control of that data. So Mary, what do you think? What does the word privacy mean to you?
To your point, Kat, it's exactly how that data is being used. So you log into Facebook, you get a pop-up to play a game. So before you start playing that game, it asks you to acknowledge how your data will be used. So at the end of the day, if we decide to play any game, we've got to make sure that our data is being used properly, and that it's protected at the end of the game, at the end of the day.
Excellent. Vanessa, what do you think?
I think it's worth here really looking at what is happening in the European Union. So in the European Union, there is a distinct right to privacy from a right to data protection. And that, in my view, really explains also why they tackle this differently, right? A right to data protection is by nature a right that is preventive, whereas a right to privacy is a right you can breach and you can remediate. And in addition, privacy is a very large word. It can mean intimacy. It can mean various things. And I think the way we use it most of the time is information privacy is likely what we mean. So there is quite a prolific academic kind of trend on trying to define privacy. Quite frankly, I gave up on that quite a few years ago. So I just made on my own definition that privacy for me, it's it's not necessarily an end goal, it's a journey, and it's a journey into keeping the trust of the people we work with. And I think I like to look at privacy from that standpoint. I think if we aim for trust, everybody wins. The consumer wins, the company wins, the government wins, the lawyer wins too, because we have more weekends, we have less contracts, everybody wins. So really, privacy, the way I see it today, is a relationship where there is a disbalance of power very often between two people, and trust comes in, as in the fiduciary duty, as in the relationship between a lawyer and a client. So maintaining that trust is where privacy step in as one of those means to get there.
That's great. That's a broad definition, right? I love that, because you do come from that legal side with that client attorney privilege. It does have different meaning. So I just want to throw in there that if you are watching live and you have any questions, please throw them into the chat and they will get to us, and we'll be sure to get to them within the hour. So all three of us are both well connected in privacy and cybersecurity. And cybersecurity as a whole is still, as we know from this conference, is still a very male-dominated world. But when you go to just privacy, privacy has 50-50, if not more, women in it. So why do we think women gravitate to privacy? And why are we maybe well poised for those roles? Vanessa, what do you think?
So traditionally, women have always been associated with the private, right? You think about the ancient Greece, the men were associated with the public. They would go and have this public debate. And that was not necessarily a pejorative thing. It was a separation of task that seems to be logical at the time. But the thing is that as carried over the year, and the logic behind this has not necessarily carried over the year. And in my view, that explains a lot why we have so many women that are chief privacy officer, chief marketing officer, in charge of consumer relationship and ethics. So when we look at boards and we see they're 50-50, 50-50 in operations, in CEO, in strategy, or 50-50 on taking care of other people. Because if what's happening is that the women are taking care of the clients and the men are taking care of the strategy of the business, that's not really progress. That's just a repetition of the past. So down the line, there is, I think, we have to be careful when we say there's more women in tech, more women in privacy, because they may come from there, from the path that is not necessarily the path that we want. Down the line, I think what's also important to understand is that the fact that we have more women in privacy does not translate in better privacy measure for women. Women actually are known to have worse privacy measure and worse cybersecurity because they notoriously, according to the studies, have no confidence into their technical skills and engineering skills. So very often, even though they understand the policy, they don't translate that into privacy engineering or digital skills. So when we say that women are well poised for roles in privacy, is that a pejorative thing down the line? Is that a stereotype that is actually not founded at all, because actually it's proven women have less skills in privacy. So why are women more poisoned for roles in privacy I think is a very interesting question that needs more study. But most importantly, if we look at the kids, the question is that socialized? And how is that socialized so that women and girls learn how to use these skills? I think is more important than having a woman chief privacy officer at the board level. So are women more poised for privacy? I don't know. Or do they make a better candidate at the directorship level for privacy so that the board is as a parity? Most likely, yes.
That's a great answer. How about you, Mary? What do you think?
I can't really comment to Vanessa's point as to why more women are getting involved in privacy, but I know there are more women stepping up and into these roles and even into cybersecurity, and it's good for them. I think we're finally getting a voice out there, and it's something that we've shown that we're able to do. It's not necessarily a male dominant role. And perhaps being female, what we deem as private versus what a male deems is most likely a little bit more different. To your point, Kat, like with that menstrual app, some men really don't understand. So with us getting out there, I think it's a positive thing.
Yeah, and I would also say from a women's danger perspective, and I've seen a lot of memes for Women's Week where people are like, every woman you know has held her keys between her hands, been followed home, like walked a little quicker on a street. Women have this innate, there is a real danger out for more women. And so, I've heard in other sessions this week about women being contacted on LinkedIn. I'm sure we've all had it, where we get contacted for non-professional reasons on LinkedIn or on Twitter. So women need privacy in a different way than men do. Like you just said, like we need privacy because sometimes putting ourselves out there results in unwanted attention and potential danger that we're not looking to have. But to your point, Vanessa, I think too, if we're going to stereotype, women are the caregivers, and I think you said that perfectly. So where women are, in my opinion, well poised to do privacy because they do consider the individual, because it is the right thing to do. Because I know that's an argument I often have with companies where they're like, well, what's the fine if I don't do this? And it's like, it's not about the fine. It's the right thing to do. Like we should care more about the individuals that we're servicing. To make sure that we're helping them. So in Canada, actually, Vanessa, you touched on GDPR, which is the European Union legislation. There's all sorts of global legislations happening right now. LGPD in Brazil, which is a huge market, CCPA in California, and then in Canada, we are getting C11. In Quebec, you're getting Bill 64. All of these are kind of culturally specific to where they serve. So I guess the question is, with Canada, with Bill C11 and some of the changes that we're seeing coming down, there isn't a lot to address the Canadian culture. So are we, as Canadians, moving in a direction with our privacy laws and protecting privacy that fits the Canadian culture? Because there are some countries where every time you use an app, and that would be places like China, and now from my understanding, India is now scraping all of your social network use for government. So in Canada, we're not doing that. Are we following culture? And are there groups in Canada that might be marginalized that we're not considering? Like we had all said, women are maybe a special interest group. Are there other groups, or including women, that we should have different privacy laws to suit? So what do you think, Vanessa?
I wouldn't say different privacy law. The thing with these type of legislation, just like when you look at intellectual property or you look at constitutional rights, there's supposed to be what we call living tree in the industry. They're supposed to grow with our culture and our change. They're supposed to accommodate that the Canadian culture is actually many cultures. It's not one culture. So they're supposed to be redacted to be broad enough for this. So having more and more legislation is not necessarily the good thing, but having a legislation that allows for taking into consideration the context is very important. Now, insofar as the legislation allows that, then comes the operationalization. It's great to say that, and that's a Canadian thing, that what is a sensitive data will depend on the context. If you look in the European Union, there's a list, and that's it. So it doesn't include financial data. Whereas here I will say, well, if you're subscribing to something that is quite unusual, well, that financial data may be very sensitive for you. So I think that's a great feature of our Canadian system. But if the person assessing is like me, I consider that I'm socially privileged. Who am I to decide the context of somebody else? So maybe the diversity will need to be important at the regulator level, at the business level, and the way that we go and apply this, and the way the courts are going to apply this, so that it's clear. Let's say, as a woman, I may feel something's an harassment. And I think my partner the other day told me, he's like, oh, this person's trolling. I'm like, this person's not trolling, this person's harassing me. And for me, it was very clear. And I think we are saying the same thing. He fully acknowledged that. But for him, it wasn't as much of a privacy intimacy intrusion as it was something that was just annoying. As for me, it was an intrusion. It was somebody that just, didn't have anything to do about my personal life. So I think there's a real danger of taking a law and interpreting 20 different ways, and then having a judge decide what is the Canadian way. So this is where we're going to have to be very mindful. And I think in particular for First Nation, I do not want to talk on their behalf. I don't think I have a right to do that, but I'd like to make sure that special consideration will be given to that and to how we live privacy as a group. So we here are very independent from other countries live more closer in society, so they may be more comfortable into sharing some information in a group that we are. So I think down the line, maybe the issue is not with the law, but will be with how we apply it over time.
That's great. Mary, what do you think?
Sorry, Kat, I've got some background noise.
I don't know if we can hear that, so I don't. If you want to go ahead.
Oh, you don't hear it?
Not on our end. Nope.
I guess with the new Bill C-11, I guess it needs to be clear to Canadians how our data is going to be used, and what's the overall benefit to us, right? And if it is misused, what are the implications?
Yeah, for sure. And I know, like, you want to actually to go back to a women's issue that men may not have considered. Women's temperatures change throughout the month as their cycle changes. So if you have a building where you are required now to take your temperature on a daily basis in order to ensure that you don't have a fever for COVID-19, you're actually giving away other information based on the fluctuations of your temperature that, again, whoever had designed that probably didn't consider if you're recording the temperature. Certainly, which are all sort of familiar with things like privacy by design. The question is, do you need to take the temperature, or could you just signal whether or not it's a fever or not a fever? And so for these technology companies that are making something, having this diverse background, culturally diverse, gender, age, all sorts of different people in there to be able to say, hey, if you're taking temperatures, here's the kind of information that I don't want to give away. So let's design the product so it actually tells you what you want to know, which again is fever, no fever, as opposed to giving away the exact temperature, which might actually reveal something else. Because we're seeing a lot of that. I appreciate it. Yep.
And Kat, I think the important part here that maybe we always forget to mention, when the law says consult the interested party, that's what it means. I think that's, that paragraph that we all skip over and we say, oh yeah, I ask my boss. No, that's what it means. If you are not that vulnerable group, you need to reach out to them and ask them how they feel about that. So that's a requirement in many of the laws. And I think that just gave the perfect example of when and how you're supposed to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But again, like, do we even have control of how our data is even used? Like, whenever you sign up for a new Facebook account, who sits there and reads the privacy policy that they have published? I may skim through it, even their security controls, but at the end of the day, we have no control of how our data is being used, or it's even sold, for that matter.
Right,
Sorry, Kat.
Yeah, sorry, that is a fundamental problem. So if you want to talk more to that, I mean, the fact that how many people actually know how their microwave works? Like, can actually describe how the electrons move around? Like, how do you know how a microwave works? And yet we stuck it in people's homes in the 80s and people just started using them. We've done the same thing with technology, except there's a cost, like you're saying. So, I mean, that's a great point. So have we allowed technology to move to the point where people just trust it, and clearly they shouldn't? I mean, is there something we should be looking at there?
Or is there an option where we could elect what data they could use?
So there are very interesting also legal development around this, around like data trust, and different means that we can use to kind of factor that trust into entrusting third parties with the data. And that's how COVID-19 app was created in Canada in particular. That's how the Sidewalk project was approached in Toronto as well. That didn't end up leading to a smart city, but it did lead to a lot of interesting questions as to how we could do that. So I think there are ways to look at how we can access, especially in the health sector, that may be some potential ways to look at. But data access and control, I think, is the ultimate paradigm, and Canada's making it even more important with the notion of consent, right? Because we're relying on it, whereas other legislation and those that are suggested right now, would have more obligations that are preventive and do not depend on anybody putting their rights in or doing anything. And that's really what I think the good aspect of Bill 64 and the new legislation is that we're not so much now in the reactive mode, we're more in the preventive mode. So it's not dependent on people like me or like, you know, somebody that maybe doesn't have any information on technology saying yes or no. Because for most people, if you ask them, do you want to scan your face to see what you're going to look like in 75 years? Everybody's going to say yes. People don't say, oh, is my data going to another country? That's a very weird thing to say. Only me says that on a Christmas party, right? So I think we have to be careful about over relying on individual and control if they don't have the capacity, because there's an issue with informed consent at that moment. But at the same time, if we put all of these governance things for businesses and they can still not access the data they need, sometimes let's in the health sector to do their job right, then it seems to me the legislation is still failing into helping innovation where it's needed. So it's a huge debate, I think, that Mary is bringing forward as to can we control the data, and is the notion of control the right notion or the notion of consent? I would have loved to see a lot more comparative study being made before Canada went on and choose which approach they wanted and why, and perhaps a little bit more transparency as to why this approach would be better than another one. And I don't think I'm seeing that level of engagement with the new legislation. So we'll have to see if the industry will kind of put their feet down and say they want to have that engagement before they vote yet again another law, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So in speaking of how a lot of this has changed with COVID, we've had to move a lot of services online, and most of them suddenly, and especially healthcare, which we'll talk about, Mary. But one of the big gripes I had was I wanted to pick up a single item from a store, and instead of anonymously walking in the store and buying the item and even potentially using cash if I wanted to, I now have to put in my name and my address and my credit card number into the store's website in order to do this touchless pickup. So I am suddenly giving far more, and it was the only option for me to actually get things from this curbside pickup, right? Is for me to provide a whole bunch of additional personal information to companies. So there are definitely ways, again, from a privacy by design perspective, I'm sure there were better ways to do that. But when you're stuck and you need something, then you're just sitting there, I have to order this thing and I need it tonight. I guess I can't run in the store. I'm going to have to give you my info. So I know we'll start with you, Mary, because of the healthcare side, especially because we've moved so much online. But are there ways we think that this forced online digital transformation has maybe improved privacy, or do we think that we've kind of left privacy behind and moved forward and just done what we needed to do quickly?
I think organizations are managing this a lot better. To your example about purchasing something online, we've got to trust, for example, Canadian Tire or even Amazon. Like when you visit their websites, their sites show the lock on the URL, noting that it's secure, and that when you're signing up, putting your information and your credit card information, that at the end of the day, it is properly protected. Whether it's encrypted in transit and at rest, like those controls are there. And again, these organizations do go through some sort of a audit, for example, PCI DSS. Similar with healthcare, there are specific regulations we have to follow under PHIPAA or HIPAA as an example. So we do have to have some trust, especially now this being the new norm, everything is remote. And we are limited with what we can do. And again, it just boils down to trust.
Yeah, and with PHIPAA, I know I've seen the Ontario government has recently released guidelines on virtual visits. So they're trying to provide that. Did you find specific to the health industry and HIPAA that there's enough safeguards in there to actually protect the data? Do you think there's enough that they've kind of stipulated those technical safeguards well enough now that we're remote that it's still valid?
For the organization that I work for, I can say that we've have the appropriate security and privacy controls in place to protect our customer information. So from our end, I would say yes. I know there's other companies doing the same, but again, this is evolving over time.
That's great. What do you think, Vanessa? Have we gone better in privacy, worse in privacy over the last year?
We've gone more aware. I think that's already a good start. What I'm seeing in my practice, and I'm working much more with startup, scale up, emerging growth. They're very interested. They ask questions. They reach out, and not the person in compliance, the CEO. They want to know how they build from scratch a company that is not going to get sued as the current company in 5 years. And I think that's a great question for a CEO. I'd like to know too. So I see a lot of changes. But I think we have to bear in mind turning the Titanic around is not easy. And when you ask these corporations to have 200 years of data to clean themselves up from trying to do it, it's a lot more complicated than putting these 4 words into an email. So I think we're very keen on criticizing the big business because we think they have more money, so they should be doing it faster. But obviously, I think we also have to understand that there's a fair amount of work that goes into there. And in many countries like the United States, the role of the board of director is to fulfill the needs of the shareholders, is not actually to fulfill the trust of the consumer. So the board of director has a legal duty to actually tend to this obligation. Now in Canada, we consider that the board also has a legal duty to be a good corporate social citizen. And I think that's a very important addition, because you can put all the laws in the world, but if you don't change the obligation of corporation, I mean, you have to understand them as well. They don't want to get sued for a breach of fiduciary duty because they decided to clean up $1 billion worth of data because they think it's more privacy secured. So I think there's a disconnect sometimes between the big company and the consumer, because that's not what I see on the market. There are very few people I've worked with that have said, I don't want to put that effort. What they're looking at is how and when, and how do I do this so my business still works. So I see a lot of improvement. I think I see less improvement in is the capacity of the consumer to understand, and the capacity of the consumer to say no to services they don't want. Not because they're not secured, just because they don't want. Maybe I don't want to. I get things delivered all the time, so that's not me. But maybe I don't want to have things delivered at my address. Maybe I work in kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm a police person and I don't want to give my address everywhere online so it can be hacked. I want to protect the security of my family. So there are many reasons why people don't want to share their data, and they're not necessarily intrinsic to the website where we're sharing the data. They may be just intrinsic to the lifestyle that I think we're allowed to have. So as much as we have frustration sometimes with the government, you're like, why can't I print that online, but I can send $1 million to India tomorrow? You know, you get so frustrated with these services. While at the same time, if they were mandatory online, I would get frustrated too. Can I talk to a human? It's a lot more complex for businesses to strike the just middle than we think. So I think the useful thing to do is have the dialogue, have the guidance, try to help, and less so criticize, unless a company has come forward and said that, you know, I don't want to respect your privacy. That's a different thing. But you have tons of small and medium companies that want to do it, and there's actually zero grant for you to do that. There's zero grant for you to say, I'm going to re-engineer this and be privacy engineering safe. So if that's really one of our value, how about we create incentive for company to do it, and we create material for consumer to understand it? Because we can't put everything on me or on the company. You know, it's a society problem.
Yeah, that was an excellent answer. Yeah, to your point about not releasing your personal address, now that we're working from home, if you are the type of person that had to have deliveries come in and come out, and you were handling paperwork, that you have to have them delivered to your house so that you can handle them and re-deliver them out. And that's not comfortable for people. Or even the fact that the contact information on your privacy policy is now your own home address, or your, right? Like there's all sorts of places where we used to list a business address, and that business address may now be your personal address, which is a fundamental problem. Yeah, so it's interesting what you said too about things being online or not online, because talking about these like marginalized communities, I was looking at vaccinations, which we have a question about, but my father is internet savvy, my mother is not. And I was thinking if my father was not around, and I don't know how my mom would have booked her vaccination appointment. So, I mean, I could have done it on her behalf, but what if she didn't have children to do that for her? So there's all sorts of things we're saying, oh, we'll just move it online. But that's not necessarily the right answer either, because not everyone has access, like you said, to be able to do that. For sure. And then the one other thing to your point about we're not giving grants, I've had the opportunity to talk to a few venture capitalists, and I suggest anyone else who's listening who has the same opportunity that I insist that they either pay for privacy impact assessments of the startups that they're working with, or they make sure those startups are running privacy impact assessments. Because if those capitalists are saying, hey, we need that product as soon as possible and we need to get it out, privacy is not at the forefront, like you just said. There's no incentive, there's no impetus to do privacy in a new product. But if a capitalist said, we're not giving you this money until we're assured that you have privacy engineering in the base of what you're doing, or privacy by design in your service, that would encourage more startups to actually make that a part of the process, for sure. So we did get a question in. Someone asked if we think the campaigns to promote vaccinations and the social media buzz about it is going to cause a lapse in privacy. I don't know, Mary, what do you think about the media around vaccinations?
The media around vaccinations?
Yeah, I presume that's the like, hey, I got vaccinated, or look what I got today. You know, the number of people holding up their little slips, which is a whole other story. Please stop doing that because your health card number's on it. Like, are we losing privacy because people are sharing this information now that used to be private information?
Again, would it be deemed private if you were to state, yes, I got vaccinated? At the end of the day, you wouldn't be disclosing who you are unless it's asking for you to state your full name, as an example. Right? If it's just an app that says, hey, I support the COVID vaccine, yes, I've taken it, I don't think that would necessarily mean that it's private information.
Yeah. What do you think, Vanessa? Are we?
I think we're going to look back on this 2020 year and 20 years from now, and we're going to be able to debrief more extensively as to what was a good idea, what maybe wasn't. I do not want to make criticizing because I don't think nobody knows. I don't think nobody has the perfect science here of the right balance between the health situation and the privacy situation. But I think I see a lot of people that don't agree, and think that the pattern of disagreement is actually to diminish other people's sense of privacy. And I don't think that's the way to go. I don't think that's aligned with the Canadian value and the Charter of Rights and Freedom. If people feel that they have the right to privacy, denying them the right to privacy is not the answer, but showing them how you will compensate for that, and taking these concerns seriously is what makes us a good society. Whether they're funded or not, that's completely irrelevant. The fact that people are expressing for the first time concerns on privacy, and that we're telling them that they're irrelevant, is certainly not going to build a very bright future. So I think we need to engage in the conversation. The truth is we can always do better. That's what privacy by design is in the first place. There is a lot of things that can be said about social media and how they can use embeddings to make some opinions look like they're always fighting, create subgroups, pro-vaccination, anti-vaccination, where there's a world in between, and how that creates maybe harassment or trolling and all of these things. So I think there's a lot of backlash in terms of privacy that we have not even begun to assess on the long term, on both on women, on children, school, and the likes. So vaccination is one of these concerns. The trade secrets are being stolen, so don't be kidding yourself that the personal information may not be stolen. So it will be interesting to see where that goes. I don't think we're going to have a different, a definitive answer today. But I think the message is do not diminish people's expectation of privacy, because maybe you don't understand them. And I don't think we have the rights to do that. And if the courts wants to decide where that stands, that is the right way to do it. It's not for us in our living room to do so.
That's great. All right, so we hear a lot about AI, right? Automatic decision making. And of course, an algorithm is only as good as the people who design it. There's all sorts of historical and anecdotal algorithms. There was one in the United States that was making court decisions, and they were putting statistically people of color away in jail more often than people who weren't, and it was not the right decision, right? But the algorithm was making decisions based on whoever had programmed it. So especially, again, marginalized groups, women, people of color, there's a fundamental problem we have with algorithms. So anyone who isn't familiar with C11 that's coming in Canada, hopefully sooner rather than later, there is an element in there about automated decision making. And now if a company is going to be using it, they have to lay out specifically how they are using that automated decision making so that individuals understand how their data is being processed and decisions are being made on their behalf. But again, it's a can of worms. We could probably do a whole hour in AI. But Vanessa, what do you think about do we need better regulation around ethics? Like, how can we ensure that we're not having bias in these algorithms? And then as individuals, how do we know when we are subject to an algorithm?
I think the problem with bias is that it's only partially related to personal information. It's entirely possible to de-identify data and have bias against an entire town without breaching any privacy laws. So one of the concerns we always have is, when you don't take the time to look at the big picture and you're trying to fix little things, then you may have a boat that's sinking behind and you don't know. We always tell that with clients when they do privacy risk assessment. It's like, do your risk assessment, then decide what you're going to do, because while you're fixing this is broken. And it's kind of the same thing with technology. We're patching one side, then we have a competition problem. Then we patch a competition problem, we have a privacy problem. So I'd like to have a table that will sit holistically, look at that, and address AI and bias. It's not entirely a privacy problem, but it also speaks to different version of privacy. So I'm not sure that that we're very advanced in that debate, although C11 would want to consider de-identified data. Some commentators say that it just fell short of innovation, actually. So it's too little and too vague and not enough. And quite frankly, I think C11 has a long way to go before it turns into a law and we have a data tribunal in Canada. So what we're going to do in terms of the last 3 years that are critical for AI, we can't rely on any legislation that's going to be AI specific, but we have a right against discrimination. We have a right to privacy. We already have all of these rights, and we already have torts, and we already have legal systems that are in place. So sometimes I wonder, do we need more laws, or do we need to start using them? And do we need to look at things differently? Because the more we ask, can that bias be mitigated? The less we ask, should we be using AI in that system to begin with? Not everything deserves to be AI driven. For example, I'm not sure I necessarily need my water bottle to use AI to tell me that I'm thirsty. I think we're displacing needs to consumer goods that are less secured before the businesses are themselves able to do automation with AI. And that should be likely an indication that maybe we're going too fast, or we're not thinking things through, and now then we're trying to fix it after. So I just want to warn people, the law is always going to catch up with technology. You can't wait for the law to fix your problem in the first time if you're in technology. That's just called having to reverse engineer something to try to find out how did you mess up and then pay for it. So that's not the way to go. So I would say trust by design is always the way to go. If you want to create trust, you won't breach the law. The law are not counterintuitive. They're there to be common sense. They're there to respect your rights. So if you look for trust and you look for what's fair, you'll find out that you actually comply with a lot of legislation on the way there. So I think we really need to start thinking about best practices and incentive rather than having penalties. So you can have R&D credits for some type of development on security that would be in addition to the current credit. So there are tons of things that we can make that doesn't involve rewriting the Canadian Charters of Rights and Freedom.
That's excellent. And that was a great point too about the incentives instead of the penalties. Because from a cybersecurity perspective, people get ISO compliant, they get NIST compliant, they get certifications put on their websites. We don't have that for privacy. So we don't really have a badge right now. And I know there's talks about certifications of privacy for C11, but we don't really have a badge to say, hey, we did the right thing. And now we've got this badge to show it. So that is a great point from a privacy perspective, that we trust is something that we have to explain that we have, but we don't have any kind of verification. What do you think, Mary, about AI and the use of AI from a privacy perspective?
Well, to Vanessa's point, I think we do have enough regulations out there. I don't know if we need any more. I think AI is critical because without AI, there's organizations that can't develop net new services, as an example, when it comes to healthcare, to assisting our elderly parents, grandparents in a better way. Should the data be anonymized? Most definitely, just to protect each individual out there, and just use the minimum information in order to gain that intelligence and to build that net new service. But at the end of the day, organizations should have the minimal privacy controls in place so that they can protect that information, because at the end of the day, there is a cost to housing that, but also advancing with services that they want to develop and promote in the future.
That's great. All right, so we did get an interesting question. I guess it's an opinion question, because I don't think there is a solid answer yet to this, about vaccine statuses. And so could those be a prerequisite in the future to access services? I mean, could you even, like, you need a vaccine status, I've heard, to get into a concert or to get into a movie theater. And then even employment, someone had mentioned. So what, like, are you going to have choices there? Or is this one of those trade-offs where we do privacy to the greater good and we just say, look, I'm going to have to give my private information in order to access this service? What do you think, Mary?
Just reading over the question, sorry. So would it be deemed private? I don't know, tough to say.
Yeah, what do you think, Vanessa? Like, are we going to have a choice, or is this just going to become something that isn't private?
The great debate of this year, I don't know if I can solve that for anybody today, but I think down the line there's a right to privacy, but there's also a right to integrity. There's a right to physical safety, health. So all of these rights are always clashing. It's not the first time. It's just, if you think about employees' right to strike versus the right to property, and this is the story of the law has been for the court to be able to make that assessment. And there's a test for this, and now you bring me back to a few years back to school. But if you look at RV Oaks, there's a four-step test that you have to follow, and it requires showing that the breach, let's say on privacy, because if you have to have a vaccination, that means you have to have your blood taken, you have to put that somewhere. I would say at the face of it, it's a breach. Then you can justify it by saying, is it justifiable in a democratic and free society? And that demonstration takes usually scientific proof, can take also the form of showing that the intrusion that you're suggesting is the most minimal intrusion you can make to achieve your purpose. See how that reflects privacy laws? It's always the case. What's your purpose, and are you proportional to get there? So I think it's going to be in the end a lawyer fight of saying, is that really achieving the goal that we want to protect COVID-19? Is it effective or not? And is there something else I could do? Let's say having tests at the airport, is it just as effective? Because if so, do I prefer to do that? So it's not something that we can necessarily answer. And I think that's something that's highly debated, it's something that can be debated. And I think we all have a personal conviction that depends on where we put our privacy. But I'm thinking of, there are cases where children were dying in the hospital because the parents have refused blood transfusion. And these cases won. They won. So there's also a question of culture. If you look in the 1980s, when the Charter of Rights and Freedom by Trudeau father was implemented, it was a very leftist Supreme Court that has given a lot of rights. And that tendency has resolved after that. It's like, oh, we went too far. We're going to try to bring it back. And now we're kind of there in the story of the law. So where's that going to go? And where's the Supreme Court's going to go, on the right or the left? And where are the Quebec courts going to go by comparison? So that's up for discussion. But there are also laws that are used right now that are emergency laws. So it will depend on the validity of their use also. So there's a lot of question up there. And I think, to be fair, that the people that are involved are also trying their best to figure it out. So it's a discussion to have, and I think we should all have a word to say. So please do not attack other people that don't agree with you, because if we want to say that this is fair and a democratic and free society, it has to start being a democratic society in the first place, right?
Yeah, you know what scares me most about the vaccinations isn't so much the unvaccinated or not vaccinated, because that's a simple thing at the surface. It's the people who have legitimate medical reasons not to be vaccinated, and then are going to then have to both disclose those reasons and defend them every single time that they want to access a service or be denied the service. And so we had that already with masking. When masking at the beginning of pandemic, if someone had a legitimate medical reason not to wear a mask, the solution was, well, then if the mask mandate's in place, then you just can't go in the store. Because you can't then we're going back to, well, if there's a stair there and you're in a wheelchair, you can't go in the store. So then how much do we say we need to support those people who can't be vaccinated? That was the whole purpose of herd immunity. And then how much do we force them to disclose more information every time they're questioned about this? So like we all said, none of us have the answer to this, because it's debatable, and it has a lot of variance here on how this is going to be executed, which will be very interesting going forward. So we have about 10 minutes left, and we're still getting questions in, which is great. We're going to shift a little bit to personal privacy instead of company privacy, and we can do to own our privacy. I always say your privacy is your responsibility, but as Mary well highlighted, people don't know what that means. That's like telling the average person that your nutritional health is your responsibility. Not everyone knows how to eat properly. Not everyone, and without that education, how do we know how to protect that privacy? And then where is that education coming from? Because that's not an education that's being freely provided. One area of this, which I know, Vanessa, you have ties into, is things like extended reality and augmented reality, which does have benefits. I hated the Google Glass when they came out because I knew that somebody could look at you while you're like walking down the road, and then based on looking at you, they could pull a whole ton of information about you up from public databases and public information. But I know you have positive uses of this technology. So where do you see people using that kind of tech? And what are the privacy concerns kind of around that?
Right. So obviously the Google glasses were a few years ago. They're really early on the market, and they were a total flop. Even Google admitted, but they learned so much. They learned that people don't want to wear tech on their face. They learned that people had privacy concerns that they didn't know of. And I think that's one of the greatest lesson of privacy by design. And the augmented reality product that came after were not augmented reality product you can walk with in the street to scan people. Quite the opposite. They're used in health tech. They're used in therapy. A lot of people with eyes problem, memory problem, are being shown things that they can remember. Now, in particular, for older people that don't want to take the risk to go to hospital, because they're one of the places where it's most likely right now that you will catch something. We have to give them health care, and maybe they can't walk, they can't go outside, they can't do different things. So through augmented reality, we're able to deliver some type of training, even physiotherapy. We're also able to have meetings. We had mergers and acquisition conducted in the augmented world, just as we have drones doing inspection of buildings now. And we have people that are showing their prototypes to the company in augmented reality, because it's like, that's the only way I can sell my product. So I think it comes back to not any technology is bad in itself, but it's really the use we make of it. And then I want to put a caveat to that. Not every technology is bad, but there are bad engineering. And there is engineering that is made to be privacy intrusive. So when you buy a toothbrush as a camera in it, I don't know what you want it to make out of it if it's not something that's privacy intrusive, right? So it's not true that technology is neutral either. So we have to be careful about that. And I think where that brings us is that you have many engineers all around the world, and they have many laws to follow when they engineer things. If you engineer an airplane, you have laws to follow. So why do you not have laws to follow when you engineer software in an airplane? So the tech industry has been very good at lobbyism that tech is neutral, but that's not entirely true. Tech can be discriminatory, and generally that comes through the engineering. Now, what that means in terms of XR is also an opportunity of a very young technology to sit down and do it right. So I think there's a consortium of companies that are interested into doing right. There are privacy lawyers that took an early look at it. And the reason is very simple. It does collect a lot of data. And it's very hard to do the data mapping of this. It's not something that most people learn, or at least I didn't learn that in law school. So it's hard to understand too. So you have to look at what is normal, and what is normal in augmented reality is not common knowledge. So they're very expensive privacy impact assessment to do because there's a lot of research. So there are concerns, but there are also, I think, a great benefits to it. And I think we just need to negotiate that. I think it's one thing to do it securely, but we need to put ethical guidelines into what's great and what's not, because you can take anything to put it in augmented reality. Just not like everything deserves AI. Some things maybe don't deserve to go into your augmented reality, including artwork of other people that are protected by intellectual property. So the rules are not entirely clear. But I think that the company I've seen so far understand that, which is very different from the internet in the 2000 bubble. We had no clue. Now today, the guy who made the internet is telling us, I made another internet who's more private. And you're like, oh, couldn't you do that with the first one? It's like, all I wanted is talk to with my friend Joe on it. I didn't know you were going to put social security number on it, right? So I think now we're more prepared of knowing that our technologies can be used for a lot of things. So people are more careful. So I see that with a good eye. I think that these companies are well equipped today, unlike 20 years ago, to make the right decision if they choose to.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great point. It is buyer beware. So on one hand, we have all this great new technology. We don't want to fear it entirely. But with all things that we're doing, please don't buy an IoT candle that turns on via your phone, please, because it's going to be turned on by a hacker at some point. There are things, like we had said, like there are things that are worth connecting, and there are things that are not worth connecting. And so you do not need a toothbrush with a camera in it. I know Pelotons have cameras in it, so I guess some people like that, but I would not be interested in putting a camera in anywhere in my house that's connected to somewhere else. So Mary, what do you think we have a few more minutes for individuals who are like, I feel overwhelmed and I just want to protect my own privacy. Like, where do they start to making sure that they're doing the best job they can to protect themselves?
From my perspective, it should be common sense. I know from my background, I've got two girls. They love signing up on all these social networking sites, social media sites. And I constantly remind them, because again, it's just a habit that I have because of my work experience. I kind of bring it home. So it's like when you sign up for a new, on a Facebook page, I go, make sure you use different information. Don't use your same username as your bank account, similar with your passports. Your password. If, let's say, it offers multi-factor authentication, include that as well, just to add that layer of protection. And if it's stuff that you don't need to share, for example, your real name, use a fake name as an example. Just share minimal information. So I keep stressing the importance to my daughters because they're at an age where they can easily get carried away and not think twice about it. But from my end, I am very diligent with where I sign up, the apps that I download for home use, etc. Because at the end of the day, even though I am cautious, I am human, I could make a mistake.
That's great advice. Thank you. What do you think, Vanessa? What is your takeaway for people who are looking to protect their own privacy?
It's going to sound counterintuitive, but I say have self-compassion. It is overwhelming. Just go with one thing. Okay, today I'm doing a password manager. This week I'm putting 5 passwords on it. Next week, something else. And it's as simple as the little thing over time. You're not going to become a cybersecurity expert tomorrow, but you don't need to either till you have your basic covered. It's as simple as yesterday I'm connecting to a website. It says, okay, do you want to give a name to your device? And I was going to put obviously Vanessa work computer. And I'm like, oh no, wait, I know better than that. If I was an hacker, I would go directly for this. So I'm like, Kate's computer, right? So, and sometimes I play a little trick and actually that makes me laugh. I just hope somebody finds it and gets, and I said, oh, I just made my own honeypot, right? So have fun doing it. Do it one little thing at a time. And overall, at the end of the year, it will build in a much stronger privacy posture than you had last year. And just do things with intent. Nobody is telling, sometimes people say, oh my God, you use social media, but you also are a privacy expert. Yes, because I understand what they're doing with my data. So I'm comfortable with the data that I put there can be done for that. So I think it's not necessarily a message of saying, drop the internet, don't use anything. Just don't use things you don't understand. Right. And if you understand it, if you know that in reality, this company doesn't keep your data private, regardless of whether it's public or not, then consider that everything you put on it could be public. Like we say, when you write an email, and maybe the only lawyers say that, but we say, when you write an email, just pretend that one day you're going to have to read it to a judge. Otherwise, don't write it. Call the person, right? It's the same thing with the internet. You're leaving a lot of trails. Do you want people to follow this trail or not? And if the answer is like no, then take precaution. If the answer is like, yeah, sure, you can see my LinkedIn. It's a public thing, it's part of my profession to do, to share that information. Then it's a conscious choices. So I think it's really about make sure that you understand. And if you don't, just wait. It's okay. You can get that shirt next week.
That's fantastic. So, I mean, again, like you both highlighted, it's really about awareness and understanding and taking the time to learn. I always like to say internet is like a kitchen knife. Like it on its own is quite dangerous, but if you know how to use it properly, it's an excellent tool. So one thing I will advocate is for you to take the time to go through every privacy setting you have. It will take time, but you hear the adage, like if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. So by default, all of these, especially free services, but even some of the ones you pay for, by default, they are going to take as much data and information from you as you will possibly give it. So you want to go through, you want to turn off things like location so that they're only being used by an app when the app is in use, instead of tracking you 24/7. You want to make sure microphones are turned off for any apps that you don't need a microphone for, especially if you have a phone in a meeting with confidential information. That phone should have either the microphone off or the phone should not be in the room. So go through them all. You will be surprised. That is always the number one feedback I get from people. Like, I had no idea how many places I was giving away information to sources I didn't realize I was giving away. So take that time. So we are at the end. So I want to thank both Vanessa and Mary so much. I hope everyone who's watched has learned a lot. You can find us on the Cyber Exchange platform, or you can come track us down in the real world. And we're always happy to answer privacy and cybersecurity questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.